All right, time for another Bearded Wonder Explains. This time we are explaining reconstruction. Reconstruction meaning to build again. And so the natural question should be, what do we need to build again? And in this case, we're talking about the government. The reason why we need to build it again is because we fought a war. You might have heard of it before, referred to as the Civil War or the War between the States, which is my preferred terminology. But in any case, in the war between the states, we have the northern states kind of representing that national government sort of perspective, and the southern states representing that states' rights kind of idea. And by the way, just so in the way of a disclaimer here, the Confederate flag is being used to identify a historical group and not to identify me specifically with that group. So just because you see it on my shirt does not mean that I am a sympathizer of slavery. I believe that it is morally reprehensible. But in any case, the North wins, and that's probably the shortest treatment that you'll ever get in American history class about the war between the states. Don't worry, we're going to come back to it later. But since they won and the South surrenders, basically when you surrender in a war, you don't get to pick how things go from that point forward. And so when the South surrenders, they ask the North what the North wants. In that case, the North is looking for their version of the government to be the version of the government. For about 10 years or so, the military kind of runs the southern states. They really don't have a government. But that ends relatively quickly, and it was always kind of designed to be that way. And the southern states kind of get back control of themselves. But the goal there is that they have to sign the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment. So let's talk real briefly about what those are. The 13th Amendment makes slavery illegal in the United States. It's a shame that it took almost 90 years for us to make that pretty common sense law, but there it is, and better late than never, I suppose. But it would have been a lot better off if we'd gotten that right in 1787 instead of 1865. The 14th Amendment is the one that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about. The first thing that it did was it freed all of the former slaves and made them citizens. There was a question of whether, they weren't a citizen when they were born, they were a slave. How do we get around that? And that's how they kind of interpreted it by saying people born in the United States are citizens of the United States. This is also some historical context for what is kind of referred to in a lot of common politics today as anchor babies. This would be the idea that people come to the United States illegally, they have children here, and the argument is made that they are citizens because of the 14th Amendment. In its historical context, that was not its intent. It was trying specifically to make sure that no southern state denied citizenship to a former slave who was now free. And so it said if they were born here, they could be a citizen, and that's its intent. The other part of the 14th Amendment is that states cannot deprive citizens of life, liberty, or property without due process. That means without going through the courts. This is a complicated idea as well because life, liberty, and property are not really very strongly defined. As the 14th Amendment, as our country has kind of interpreted the 14th Amendment throughout time, it has come to mean any kind of constitutional right. And so it has been used to cancel state laws through the Supreme Court, which is kind of the opposite of federalism. But that, in its historical context, they're probably talking about something a little bit more limited than that, probably literally talking about life, liberty, and property. And we can tell that by the fact that they felt the need to pass the 15th Amendment, which said that voting restrictions cannot be based on race. So if the 14th Amendment, life, liberty, and property really meant like all rights, voting would have been one of those, and they wouldn't have needed a 15th Amendment, but they did. These three amendments would seem to kind of put to rest slavery and its legacy. You would expect that we should have something like social equality between races. However, there was a loophole, and the people in the South found it very quickly, which is why we kind of have it coming back from the dead here. And it's this: life, liberty, and property was not clearly meant to be voting rights. Well, the 15th Amendment says you can't deny it based on race, and the white Southerners said that's fine. We'll make it based on education. And the reason why that was a problem was because a lot of the slaves in the South who had just been freed had never been given an education. As a matter of fact, it was illegal. Nat Turner had an education, and that got real ugly real quick. And so you weren't allowed to teach slaves to read, write, or anything else like that. And so the reason why we eventually have to have a civil rights movement 100 years later is because these amendments that were kind of intended to bring black citizens up to an even level with other citizens in the country, there were loopholes. And by the way, they were aware of those loopholes when they made them. And racism was just as much of a problem in the North. And there were a lot of people in the North who were fine with African Americans, freed slaves, becoming citizens, but still didn't want them to vote or to be equal. And so those loopholes were deliberately not closed when these amendments were made, sadly, because that was where our country was. That's it for our presentation today on Reconstruction. Our next presentation will focus on the political party system in America and its history. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a good day.